Today we are reading in Mark chapter 2. We're starting at verse 23, and we're going to read two very short vignettes dealing with Jesus and the Sabbath. So we're on page 36. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some of it to his companions." And then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." And then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. Well, I've mentioned this before. I think it bears repeating. Mark is the gospel in a hurry. Of the four gospels, Mark is the shortest and the most concise. Where two or more gospels tell the same story, Mark's version is the bare bones one. Other gospels will usually give more details, flesh out the story a little bit more. Not Mark. Mark makes his points and moves on. Tellingly, Mark uses the word immediately 41 times. Everything happens quickly in Mark. This serves to propel the narrative forward at a breakneck pace, and this pace never slackens. So why is Mark in such a hurry? Because it's driving the reader forward to something, to a conclusion, to an idea, to a concept, maybe even to a decision. And that in itself is not unique to Mark. All the Gospels are written with some goal in mind. John is the more forthcoming because he just lays out what that goal is. He writes in John chapter 20, "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So, like I said, all the Gospels want to do that. All the Gospels want you to come to faith, and that's what makes a gospel as a genre. A gospel is written to convince you to put your faith in Jesus. But Mark's way of doing that is like no other gospel. And we're going to have a look at it today. So grab your pew Bibles. We're going to use all the pew Bibles because it's a common Bible. And turn to page 55. We're going to turn to the end of Mark's gospel. And if you read down the left-hand column on page 55, right here, you will see the first heading is the shorter ending of Mark. Then you read down a little bit, and you see the longer ending of Mark. And after both of these headings, you see material enclosed in brackets. I don't know if you've ever seen that before or noticed that. And if you've noticed it, maybe you've wondered why that is. Well, today you're going to find out. Most scholars agree that these endings, this material, enclosed in brackets, are later additions to the original form of Mark. Now, they aren't there as some bit of fakery. They aren't there to throw us off the track necessarily. They're there because Mark ends his gospel in the minds of the early church a little too early. And so what editors did was took material from other gospels and kind of patched it on the end to make Mark look like all the other gospels. Okay, fine. But what happens when we take that stuff away? Well, what you have is the original ending of Mark. So if you read backwards, back through the longer ending of Mark, back through the shorter ending of Mark, and go one verse above that, verse 8, that's where scholars believe, and I agree, Mark actually ends his gospel originally. Okay, so what does Mark do? How does Mark end? Well, familiarly, the women come to the tomb, find it empty, see this guy sitting there who tells them that Jesus is risen, he is not in the tomb, and then he gives the women a message. And the message is to go back to the disciples and remind them that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. So far, so good. Until the last verse, verse 8, the original and first ending. Here's what it says. So, hearing this, they, the women, fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So where does the resurrection message go? Well, according to Mark, it doesn't go anywhere. The people charged with the news of the resurrection, the first people to see the empty tomb and to speak with the angel and get this message, this mission, are too frightened to do any of it. And so the original ending of Mark does not mention any resurrection appearances. It doesn't say anything about Jesus showing up to his disciples, saying, "Peace be with you," showing him the wounds of his crucifixion, having a cookout on the beach, or any kind of conversation at all. None of that happens in the original ending of Mark. It's kind of like an ending without an ending. You know, we got all the way through the story and we didn't get the punchline. The story didn't resolve. There is no happy ending. Why does Mark do this? Well, I think it's a reasonable explanation for both how it ends and how it's written. Here it is. There's an urgency to Mark's presentation of Jesus' story. There's a reason Mark sticks only to the bare facts, because he wants to give you just enough information to write the ending of the story yourself. You've got all the testimony. You've been brought right up to the empty tomb. You've heard what Jesus has said. You've seen the miracles he's performed. You've listened in to Jesus' chats with his most intimate followers. So you are offered the chance to write the ending of Mark. Mark's not going to give it to you. He says it's in you. You finish the story. And if all this is true, which I believe it is, can't prove it, but I believe it's true, then everything Mark has to say about Jesus is best understood in light of this purpose: to embed the story of Jesus into your story, to put the life of Jesus into your life so that you now possess the gospel as part of you. So our reading today is a very good example of this thing that Mark wants to do with us. We meet Jesus, like I said, in two very brief vignettes involving Jesus and arguably the center of Jewish faith, and that is the observance of the Sabbath. What does Jesus say and do here will go a long way to establishing who he is and what he's all about. Now, even though Mark writes with great urgency, it's important for us not to read Mark too quickly, especially because he moves from idea to idea to idea. If we read Mark too quickly, we might come away from these two stories, thinking that the law is bad, Jesus is good, the Sabbath is good, but the Pharisees are bad, or something like that. But I don't think that's what these stories are about. The first story first. Jesus is walking through a grain field, and his disciples are plucking grain off the stalk and eating it as they go. They're hungry. What exactly the Pharisees are doing in that grain field, Mark doesn't tell us. Can you imagine they're walking through a grain field and all of a sudden, all these Pharisees stand up and go, aha! But anyway, whatever they're doing there, they notice that it looks like Jesus' disciples are breaking the Sabbath. Harvesting is work. Work is not allowed on the Sabbath. Therefore, Jesus, as their teacher, is guilty of, suborning, if you will, the breaking of the Sabbath. Jesus responds by citing a story in 1 Samuel where David, on the run from King Saul, eats bread reserved in the temple that's been consecrated as a sign of God's, the life God gives to Israel. It's called showbread. Bread being the staff of life in the temple. God is the staff of life. Think about manna in the wilderness and all that kind of stuff. So it's consecrated. It's not for anybody to eat except the priests, and only in a special way. But Jesus reminds the Pharisees that, when David was fleeing from Saul and he was hungry, he and his confederates went into the temple and ate that bread. And then comes the zinger. The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. But of course, the Pharisees already know that, right? In fact, the Pharisees' own commentary on the Old Testament, we call it the Talmud, says, profane one Sabbath for a person's sake, that he may keep many Sabbaths. Okay. So I suppose the Pharisees could quibble with how badly the disciples really needed to eat in that moment. I mean, they're not on the run from a murderous king, but neither their gleaning nor the idea that people are more important than the meticulous observance of the Sabbath really isn't why the Pharisees are upset. What gets them going is the very last thing Jesus says. So, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Now, them's fighting words. They're fighting words because Jesus is claiming for himself lordship over the Sabbath. And if Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, that means nobody else can be. That means the Pharisees can't be. Which means the Pharisees are not the legitimate custodians of the law, which they, of course, think they are, right? They're hiding in grain fields, waiting to catch people harvesting, on the Sabbath. They think they are the guardians of right and wrong. But Jesus says, no, you're not. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So you Pharisees can't be. And in doing this, Jesus reminds them of a central feature of Israel's faith, and that is the Sabbath is God's good work for us, not the other way around. Right? So the Sabbath is God's gift to us, God's good work for us. Our observing the Sabbath is not a work we offer to God. No, because he's already offered it to us. So here we see Jesus is the one willing to speak truth to power. Jesus is the one on our side. The next story packs an even bigger punch, both because it happens in the context of worship in the synagogue, and it deals with an actual human being in need. So another Sabbath has arrived. We don't know if it's later on the same Sabbath, but it's the Sabbath. Jesus is where he always is, in the synagogue, a faithful Jew. So are the Pharisees, and so is a man with a withered hand. So seeing the man's need, Jesus heals him on the spot. It's tempting to see this healing as Jesus' way of kind of tweaking the Pharisees' noses, but this time it has nothing to do with the Pharisees. It has everything to do with the suffering of the man with the withered hand. If the Sabbath is God's good work for us, and Jesus has already established this, then why should anyone have to wait until the Sabbath has ended to be relieved of his or her suffering? Jesus' answer is nobody should have to wait. You might remember another healing Jesus does for a woman bent over for 18 years. Again, Jesus and the Pharisees sort of get into an argument about how the Sabbath should be honored. The Pharisees think, she's waited 18 years. She can wait another day. But here's what Jesus thinks about that. He says, ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? The Sabbath is best honored when people are cared for, Jesus contends, and without delay. Here we see some of that urgency of Mark. We're not going to heal, we're going to heal right now. And that goes for hungry people and withered hand people and people bowed down by disease. That goes for everybody in need. If the Sabbath is God's good work for us, then let God work. That's what Jesus is saying. Before we finish up what these stories are meant to teach us about Jesus, it's important to say what they're not meant to teach us. At no point in either of these stories does Jesus assail the Sabbath or God's law. They're both good. They're both designed to work for the good of the people. And any interpretation of the law which makes the Sabbath or the law anything different from this is illegitimate. Any interpretation of the law or the Sabbath that does not see and does not respond to human need is wrong. But what's also wrong is living the law. That's the Pharisees' mistake. They live the letter of the law, and that gives them a perspective that can only see two things. Are you obeying the law, or in our opinion, are you disobeying the law? And that leads them to be pictured in the Bible as very kind of self-righteous people. The law police running around wagging their fingers at people. And I don't want to get, too hard on the Pharisees, because in general, the Pharisees are very faithful people who believe what they're saying and believe that they have a legitimate way of honoring God by meticulously obeying every single law. But Jesus says when you live the law that way, you forget to see the people the law is supposed to protect and support and embrace. Right? If you live the law, what do you see? You see the law. What you don't see is human beings. Right? Women bent over, men with hands that don't work. So we're not called to live the law like the Pharisees do. We're called to live something different. What we are called to live is the gospel. And that's what Mark wants us to know about Jesus. Jesus lived the gospel. And Mark wants us to live it too. How do we do that? We live as Jesus lived. Very simply, Jesus stood up for people, especially the people who were unheard, unseen, or desperately in need. Jesus came to the aid of hurting people, and he didn't let anything or anyone stand in his way, which gives us some of our core convictions about Jesus. Jesus is good. Jesus gives. Jesus is Lord. At the heart of Jesus' ministry, at the heart of God's reign, is healing and wholeness, life and vitality, restoration and renewal. There's no time to wait. It's happening right now. That's the message Mark has for his own time, and that's the message Mark has for our time. God is up to something. It began with Jesus. It continues still. And you can be a part of it. Your life can finish the story that Jesus' life began. And I guess it really comes down to how you think Mark's gospel really should end. Lord God, thank you for the way you teach us about the law and about the Sabbath and about your love that is inexhaustible. Your love that came to us in the life and the death and the resurrection of your dear Son, Jesus. Help us every day to live into Jesus' way of living the gospel, to see people before we see the rules, to see need before we see right or wrong. Because that's the way Jesus lived. That's how Jesus saw the world. And as we follow him, that's the way we're called to see the world as well. That is not easy. That takes a lot of energy. That takes a lot of concentration. And frankly, that takes a lot more than most of us have on our own. And that's why we always thank you for how you come to us day after day, week after week, month after month, to remind us how powerful, how present you are. And you give us over and over and over again your life and your love as it comes to us in the sacrament of Holy Communion. And so we remember that in the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread and gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this for the remembrance of me." Again, after supper, he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and drink. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sin. Do this for the remembrance of me." And so we eat and we drink and we remember, praying the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.